622 vulnerabilities named in a single week, and a 1,380% surge in phishing. Defenders aren't losing ground on one front, they're losing it on two at once. Well, today we're diving into what you can do about it.
Welcome to Shadow Talk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Alexandra Moore, Threat Intelligence Manager.
And I'm John Dilgen, Threat Intelligence Analyst. On today's episode, we're focusing it on initial access and the two primary methods that threat actors are using to enter networks: vulnerabilities and identity compromise.
Yes, exactly. It feels like there's an unfortunate reality today in security operations that organizations are just stuck playing whack-a-mole with one initial access problem at a time. We've got new threats that are constantly surging. And in the last few weeks, even, our own team has identified multiple new threats around identity compromise and phishing.
Yeah, to that point, our team has recently released two reports, one on a new extortion group known as Helix, that's using the same identity compromise tactics as Shiny Hunters, and another report where we found two new phishing kits that steal sessions and credentials to facilitate unintended access, which really demonstrates how quickly the landscape is evolving.
Yeah, it definitely does. And then I guess on the other hand, you've got vulnerability exploitation, and that's not slowing down either. We're all still aware of the unfolding flood of vulnerabilities from these frontier AI models like Mythos. And in fact, just last week, we had Microsoft announcing the largest number of vulnerabilities ever in a single patch Tuesday, which I'm sure has caused a lot of people sleepless nights trying to think how to prioritize that. So today, we're going to make sense of the threat landscape and help organizations understand what they need to prioritize for defense. So let's jump into it. John, can you start maybe by walking the listeners through what you've described as this initial access problem?
Yeah, certainly. And so the tough challenge that defenders have today is that they need to prioritize defenses for both initial access methods of vulnerabilities and identity compromise. But as we go through this episode, we're going to help simplify the landscape and really make it in plain English what you need to do to defend against these latest threats.
Great.
So to start off, there's no doubt that social engineering and identity compromise drive incidents. Groups like Shiny Hunters use voice phishing, session theft, and account compromise for data theft and extortion. Meanwhile, tactics like ClickFix or copy-paste abuse have been leveraged by initial access brokers, ransomware groups, and nation-state threat actors to harvest session tokens and deploy malware. Recently, our threat research team discovered a new group that calls itself Helix, conducting voice phishing attacks for account takeover to fuel data exfiltration and extortion.
All right, excellent. Really want to dig into Helix here. So is this a completely new group or maybe a branch of another? I know we've seen that going on a lot lately with rebrands and splintering of the scene.
We certainly have, and that's a good question. Helix likely emerged from other groups like Shiny Hunters and Blackfile, as their attacks are very similar. So they call a target and convince them to navigate to a device code phishing page that uses legitimate authentication flows to grant access to the user's account. Helix often impersonates the target's direct manager via a caller ID on the initial phone call and directly over the phone, which helps them create urgency and authority so that the user is more likely to navigate to the phishing site. Once they gain that access, the group uses automated scripts to quickly exfiltrate SharePoint data that they can then use for the extortion.
All right, excellent overview there. So this attack chain that you've just described, is it, I guess, one for one with these previous groups, or are they doing something new as part of the attack chain?
Yeah, there is something new, and I'd say the most notable finding that's come from this report is the use of the accounts during the attack chain. So what we found is that one account is used for the full compromise from initial access all the way through exfiltration. However, threat actors also compromise another account, which they use exclusively for the extortion demands against the organization. Now, this is likely done to make incident response efforts more difficult, as defenders often tunnel vision the account making the extortion demands, which really has no major investigation or remediating value. And this increases the time that it takes to find the true source of the compromise and get it remediated. Now, earlier we also mentioned ClickFix, which is a form of social engineering that has a display on web pages to trick users into executing malicious commands or authenticating with a man in the middle style attack by masquerading as software updates or a CAPTCHA to verify that the user is human.
Yeah, and I guess just to pause there and interrupt for a second, adding a little bit of context for users. So ClickFix is so important. I know we've mentioned it a lot, but we have seen it be the top method of delivering malware throughout 2026 so far. So something that all organizations really should be aware of.
Yeah, exactly. It certainly should be top of mind. And, the consistency it's had as the top method throughout 2026 really shows how successfully attackers are using it to gain initial access.
Yeah.
And on top of that, recent reports show that ClickFix is sold as a malware as a service, and it can be purchased on online criminal forums for as little as $250 a month or $1,500 for lifetime access. And this price makes it widely accessible for even new and unskilled threat actors, which greatly increases the volume of attacks and campaigns that use the method and likely feed into the volume organizations see as well.
All right, brilliant. So we've covered identity attacks a little bit there, but what about vulnerabilities? That was the second thing that you wanted to cover in this episode.
Yeah, and unfortunately, defenders really aren't getting a break there either. Just this week, Microsoft announced its largest Patch Tuesday ever, or the highest number of vulnerabilities named within a single Patch Tuesday release at 622. Of those, two are actively exploited 0 days. And of those two, one, which is CVE 2026 56164, is a critical remote code execution vulnerability in SharePoint, which importantly is the same technology that we see groups like Helix and Shiny Hunters target for exfiltration. Just this week as well, a report showed that Quillen, one of the top ransomware groups, was exploiting a new CVE in firewalls for initial access. The CVE allows unauthenticated attackers to bypass login controls entirely and establish legitimate looking VPN sessions, which Quillen operators use as a starting point to deploy their ransomware across the network. And I think another great example of the range of initial access attacks that organizations are facing is directly from Shiny Hunters, who in June exploited an Oracle PeopleSoft 0 day known as CVE 2026 35273. And this group is the same group that is leading a lot of the voice phishing and OAuth abuse attacks, while also weaponizing a 0 day for their same end goal of data theft and extortion. Again, just highlighting that pressure defenders are under.
Yeah, and I think the volume that you mentioned earlier is really what stands out to me. You mentioned 622 vulnerabilities. And if I think back probably a few weeks ago now to our episode on Claude Mythos and how we were warned of this flood of CVEs that would all be stemming from Mythos discovering all these new flaws, it really feels like that's coming home now, right? So I guess my question is, was Mythos or AI in some way used to find all these Microsoft vulnerabilities?
Yeah, it certainly was. So, not exactly Mythos, but rather Microsoft's multi-model agentic scanning harness, what they call M dash. It was likely used to surface these bugs. Now, Microsoft did not explicitly state how many in this Patch Tuesday were found by M dash, but they did state that AI is drastically speeding up the discovery rate of these vulnerabilities in the Windows code base. All right, so that was a lot of context that we explained on the threat landscape. So, Alex, let's change it up a little bit and do something different. And let's actually kind of debate this here. So, for the organizations and defenders listening right now who have tight budgets and head counts, looking at these two problems of identity compromise and vulnerability management, which side do they pick? I'll take the vulnerabilities, you take identity, and let's make the case for them.
All right, happy to. This should be interesting. So for me, identity wins, and I think it's not even close, right? We can take the volume to start off with. We saw a 1,380% growth in phishing between late 2025 and early 2026. Then you've had groups like Shiny Hunters, Shiny Hunters alone compromising over 760 companies, largely leaning on this social engineering technique that we've spoken about in multiple episodes that really targets identity and doesn't need to use clever vulnerabilities or malware to get in, just needs to compromise a user. And that's not a trend now. It's not like a sort of flash in the pan. It is now the primary way that attackers are getting in, and we're seeing it constantly and we're seeing it evolve, but it's still the core problem. And then I think other than the volume, it's that the tactics are so clever because they're really engineered to bypass the controls that defenders already have. It seems to signal a real understanding of how security operations work. So, for instance, we have device code phishing, right, which uses a legitimate OAuth authentication flow. So that means that your users won't spot it, and many detections aren't going to fire on it either. Then we've got ClickFix that you've already mentioned, which has evolved from things like pasting a command into a terminal, which is, a bit technical, a bit unfamiliar to a lot of end users. And then now we've seen it pasting login URLs into an attacker's man in the middle page in order to carry out session theft, and using different lures on web pages to trick unsuspecting users, and just making it so much more accessible for those end users. And then, of course, we've got what you might call the remediation problem. So Helix that we talked about, the new group that we've been following, as you mentioned, they compromise one account for the attack chain and then a second account, which is exclusively for that extortion demand. So we're thinking that that's exclusively to burn defenders' time while they're focusing on the wrong account. It's a bit of misdirection there. And we've seen attackers registering 5 or more persistence devices per compromised account. So I think, to sum it up, really, even when you catch it, the cleanup is harder than it was a year ago. So for identity, my arguments would be we've got the volume, we've got the evasion, and it's also where the remediation cost is going to be highest.
Yeah, you've laid out a very solid case there,
Thank you.
but I do need to push back a little bit. So I'd say vulnerabilities are the side that scales without a human in the loop. Identity attacks still require a phone call, a lure, a user to click, but vulnerability exploitation doesn't. And Quillen, for example, just weaponized a firewall CVE for unauthenticated VPN sessions this week with no user involved, working for ransomware deployment. Shiny Hunters also exploited the PeopleSoft 0-day for the same extortion outcomes that we've described on the identity side. And I think the volume cuts both ways. 622 vulnerabilities in this most recent Patch Tuesday, with the web browser Firefox seeing similar spikes in vulnerability discovery from AI. Google's Big Sleep, for example, has disclosed 20 plus open source bugs. ISLE found 12 of 12 OpenSSL 0 days in just one benchmark run. Every frontier lab, including Anthropic's Glasswing and OpenAI's Daysbreak, is dumping bugs into the same disclosure pipeline that defenders are already drowning in. And it's not just a spike, but it's a permanent step change in the discovery rate. I think complexity around vulnerabilities is worse too when you factor in things like vulnerability chaining. For example, Inc. ransomware is chaining edge device vulnerabilities together to have crafted web requests that trick the device into making internal requests on their behalf. Then they're able to execute code for ransomware deployment. Identity attacks are hard, but the volume and the complexity behind vulnerabilities cannot be ignored.
All right, I think you do make a good case there. And what sticks out to me actually is that there are parts where we do agree. Sorry, we are in agreement. So notice what all the examples that you gave have in common. Actually, we've got PeopleSoft, SharePoint, edge devices. So that signals that the attackers don't really care about which door they're using. You've got Shiny Hunters that is running phishing campaigns and 0-day exploitation for the same extortion outcome. So they're targeting both of the sides of the argument that we've been debating here. So this means that the initial access method is often interchangeable, even in the same group. But I guess the objective that they're trying to get to isn't.
Yeah, that's a great point. So maybe a reframing here is instead of having a pick one answer for the defenders and the organizations, maybe the reality is it's both. Because if when it comes down to it, if you over rotate on identity, then Quillen can walk in through your firewall. But if you over rotate on vulnerabilities, then Helix can walk in through a device code prompt. So the trap here is really thinking that these are two competing problems that compete for the same budget, but they're both entry points to the same crown jewel, data in your network. So both really have to be defended.
Yeah, of course. And I know that sort of sounds like we're just saying do everything, but the real question here, I suppose, isn't identity or vulnerabilities. It's just thinking for my particular environment, what is the shortest path that an attacker has to get to my sensitive data, and have we closed this? And that is going to be different for every organization, even though we've obviously got these trends and these big issues that we talk about. For a lot of organizations that we've worked with, SharePoint and SaaS applications are particularly short entry paths right now. And we're finding that organizations can be breached through either door on the way there. So those are common priorities that we see. But as you mentioned, you really can't take your eye off either one of them.
Yeah, exactly. And when we get back after the break, we're going to break things down for defenders for what are the top priorities to help shore up your defenses against both these vulnerabilities and identity compromise.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Grey Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
All right, we are back. So, John, we talked about how we were going to help organizations do both. So, how should organizations defend?
Yeah, so we kind of left off there discussing the crown jewel, which is really a good strategy here in your defenses. And one pattern that we've seen across these attacks that we've called out is the targeting of the sensitive data locations like SharePoint and your software as a service or SaaS applications. And to defend against this, organizations need robust access policies that control which users can reach sensitive data. Sensitive data should only be accessible from trusted locations and devices as well. And likewise, organizations need proper logging for these tools, including data access events, to ensure that any attempts to steal data can be detected and contained automatically before that exfiltration takes place. Beyond access policies and logging, organizations also need data layer controls, specifically tools like data loss prevention or DLP and sensitivity labeling on your data in SharePoint and your SaaS applications. When Helix's automated exfiltration script fires, for example, a DLP policy that blocks bulk downloads of documents that have been tagged with confidential or restricted tags is a major line in the defense to stop the theft, even after an identity is compromised or a vulnerability is exploited.
All right, excellent. That's a good start. So then beyond hardening those SharePoints and SaaS targets themselves that we spoke about, I think organizations also need to close the identity pathways that attackers are using to reach them. I think that's a good next step.
Yeah, it definitely is. So around that end, the Helix kill chain is a really good example. The group abused device code authentication, which is really mixed into a legitimate OAuth flow that's designed for mobile apps, or I should say mobile devices and similar devices that can be hard to enter a password on. So threat actors use this workflow to convert a single voice call into a valid access token and compromise the target's accounts. So to shut down this path, organizations should pull the list of accounts in their environment that are permitted to authenticate via the device code grant flow, and then restrict or block that flow for any account that does not have a serious business use case for it, especially looking at the accounts that have broad access to file storage and collaboration platforms.
So I guess to summarize what you're saying there, the gap here is really about visibility and policy. So if you haven't audited who can use device code grants, for instance, you almost certainly have no controls in place to stop them or to interrupt this attack pattern.
Yeah, exactly. And with an explicit policy that can restrict the device code grant authentication flows, especially for your high value accounts, then Helix won't be able to turn that voice phishing call into a valid token, breaking their kill chain at the initial access stage before they can ever get to exfiltration.
All right, so hardening identity is going to help close one of the doors that we've spoken about as a major problem right now, but defenders still have to contend with this flood of vulnerabilities on the other side of the equation. So to help manage the vulnerability flood, I think organizations should prioritize vulnerability management around two factors. So first is going to be the vulnerability itself, and then second, the host's risk exposure. So to understand the vulnerability, organizations can use scoring like CVSS temporal scoring, which is a component of the CVSS score that actually weights a vulnerability's what we call static base score, which is based on factors that change over time. So things like the availability of functional exploit code or the status of patches or fixes, and then the level of confidence that we have in the threat data. And when you look at the CVSS scores on NIST's website, these factors are explicitly scored where possible, and they really should be analyzed and looked at to help ensure that a patch has the proper prioritization when it hits your management queue, so to help you decide what to do first. And then we've also got CISA's KEV, or known exploited vulnerabilities. This is a catalog that CISA maintains, and it should also be monitored for vulnerabilities that need to move to the top of your remediation queue again. So then on the host side, we've got organizations needing to inventory their own critical servers and network devices to really understand which devices exist, which firmware is running on them, and what defenses are set up around them. And if you have a proper understanding of the risk that's created by the vulnerability, calculated against the exposure of the host, then as an organization, you can quickly understand which vulnerabilities are the greatest threat and sort of chart a clear path through this flood of vulnerabilities and CVEs.
Yeah, I think that's some very good advice. And I'd say typically that host analysis process is very manual and time consuming for organizations, but an AI attack surface management tool can quickly help you cut through that volume and the workload to help defend your devices. Now, as we start bringing this to a close, the last recommendation I have for organizations is that they need to ensure that their incident response playbooks can completely remediate these threats. There's two ones we've called out. We've seen those multiple persistence devices registered to an account after phishing. So organizations need to ensure that a response procedure is in place to quickly remove all recently joined devices from the user's account. Ideally, this is a workflow that should be automated around identity detections to help contain the threats as fast as possible. Also, if extortion demands start coming from one compromised internal account, your IR procedures should quickly hunt for additional compromised accounts that have been performing exfiltration from SaaS applications to help identify the true source of the activity quickly.
Yeah, exactly. So as we're coming to the end of the episode now, let's sort of pull this back to what you actually do with everything that we've talked about, depending on what your role is. So if I start with the message for the security leaders, on the vulnerability side, the first step is really knowing what you're protecting. So you need to be building or refreshing your inventory of critical servers and network devices. You need to know what's running, what firmware version, and what compensating controls you've got in place around them. And this inventory is really going to be the foundation for any meaningful prioritization that you start to layer on top of that. From there, we'd also recommend using the CVSS temporal scoring and CISA's KEV catalog that we mentioned earlier to help you rank that remediation queue. The vulnerabilities that belong at the top aren't just going to be the highest base scores. They're going to be the ones with things like an active exploit code, a confirmed proof of concept, or evidence of active exploitation in the wild. And that should be where your team's time goes first. So that simple numerical prioritization there based on the score isn't going to be adequate and needs something layered on top of that. And then I think the tomorrow morning action for our security leaders is to pull the list of accounts in your environment that are permitted to authenticate via device code grants. Talked about this throughout the episode as an issue. So you need to know who is on that list. And if you don't know who's on that list, that's a key gap. You need to be able to restrict or block the authentication method for any account possible. So starting with accounts that have broad access to active SaaS applications that hold sensitive data. And I think just with that one single policy change, you're really going to help break one of the most active identity compromise methods that we've been seeing in recent attacks.
All right. I think those are some great recommendations. Taking things home for the operators here, I have 2 tomorrow morning actions for you to focus on. First one is around your SaaS visibility. If you don't have logging enabled for data access events in SharePoint and your collaboration tools, then you really have no way to detect the data theft that we've outlined in these attacks. So you need to audit your logging coverage today, not just whether logging is on, but specifically whether you have bulk download events being logged, sharing events, and access events. You also want to make sure that they're being fed to your detection pipeline with automated response set up behind them to help contain and stop the exfiltration. Second, your IR procedures. Review your identity compromise runbook and confirm 2 things. 1, that it includes a step to enumerate and remove all recently registered devices from a compromised account. This goes beyond just revoking the sessions and resetting the passwords. You need to make sure that every device is removed. And then second, you need to make sure your IR process also includes a hunt for additional compromised accounts that are performing exfiltration from SaaS applications if you see one account making extortion demands. The tactic of using a separate account exclusively for extortion means that the single account remediation will still leave you exposed. So both of those are top priorities when you come in tomorrow. In closing, initial access threats are increasing in volume and becoming more advanced. So in order to stay ahead, organizations need to restrict device code authentication, prioritize your most actively exploited vulnerabilities, and build IR procedures that hunt every account and device an attacker leaves behind. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to get in touch, as a reminder, we just added a feedback survey in the Linktree. It only takes a couple minutes, so please let us know how we can improve. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk.